So the lungs actually, in doing that movement of expanding and then recoiling back in inspiration, expiration, they're actually pushing as well on the vein that runs back up. You have the inferior vena cava that goes right back up, right to the left atrium. They push on that as they're inspiring and expiring to help. What do you think that will do? And if it's pushing on the inferior vena cava, helping the blood get back to the heart. Again, venous blood pressure very, very, very low. So it needs the skeletal muscle pumps, it needs the venous valves, also the lungs in respiration help return blood flow to the heart. You might not think about that, but they do a lot of other things than just gas exchange. So secreting enzymes, they're involved in hormone cascades starting at the kidneys to regulate salt and water balance in the body, aiding in venous return to the heart. Also, what about dealing with situations like we talked about the 4 F's? Remember? And that is on the lecture exam, right? We talked about peripheral nervous system, sympathetic nervous system, anatomy and effects, parasympathetic nervous system, anatomy and effects overall. What happens with those two parts of the nervous system? What is something that relates to the lungs?
Breathing.
Breathing, okay. Breathing what? Increasing respiration rate, right? So dealing with responses like sympathetic activation, dealing with the 4 F's or the fight or flight, being able to open up those bronchioles, get more air into the lungs, and in essence get more oxygen by gas exchange out into the tissues. That allows you to increase your oxygen capacity, your aerobic capacity, your ability to run, to endure, to deal with situations, right? So the nervous system activates those and changes the needs of respiration based on the needs of the body. Okay, so there's a lot of things just other than O2-CO2 exchange. What would happen if the cervical plexus was damaged, resulting in a dysfunctional phrenic nerve? This is review as well. You might not think it is, but it is. We talked about cervical plexus, brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, sacral plexus, and the major nerves that branch from those plexuses. And I went over one major nerve of the cervical plexus that comes out from the spinal nerves in the cervical region that was really important. And that was the phrenic nerve. What would happen if cervical plexus was crushed, say C1 or C2, right at the very top of the cervical plexus, and there was damage to the phrenic nerve? It could no longer function. You would have problems breathing. Respiration would virtually cease. Because the phrenic nerve leaves the cervical plexus, goes down, and goes to the diaphragm, the lungs, right, to allow respiration to continue without you having to think about it. Now, can you speed up your respiration by thinking about it? Yes. You can slow down your breath. This is like the premise of meditation and quieting, right? You can calm your respiration rate, get into a more parasympathetic activated state, and slow down respiration. You can also speed it up or even get nervous about something and you will start breathing faster. Your heart will start pumping at a faster rate. But if you have a problem with the phrenic nerve, yeah, you're going to have respiratory problems or respiratory failure, because that is helping to continue it at that normal rate without you having to think about it. So we can also activate it consciously, but it's always going to keep working. This is just to show we have the left phrenic nerve that comes right here. Here's the cervical plexus up here. Here's the voice box of the laryngeal cartilage. The trachea goes down into the bronchi that serve the left and the right lung. Okay, so the phrenic nerve goes right all along here, goes to the diaphragm, and sort of keeps the diaphragm contracting or moving down, and then relaxing and moving up. Contracting, and that is what acts to open up the thoracic cage and allow the lungs to keep inspiring and expiring with respiration. Okay, so I just want to illustrate the lungs actually do a lot of different things. It's not just gas exchange. And the whole respiratory system is composed of the upper respiratory tract and then the lower respiratory tract, or the conducting versus the respiratory zones. So if we look at the upper respiratory tract, we've got these nasal meatuses, basically these canals that are lined by mucous membranes, and we've got the superior, middle, and inferior meatuses, the nasal concha. Remember this nasal concha that are part of, there's a bone. Remember there's a bone, it's kind of the keystone bone back behind the nose. Not the sphenoid, that's a little higher up in the cranial vault base, but it's right back behind the nasal cavity.
Yeah.
Ethmoid, good, Jesse, ethmoid, yes. Ethmoid bone, it has the superior nasal concha, and then it has the middle nasal concha, and then the inferior nasal concha is its own separate bone, right, on the lateral aspects of the nasal cavity. So all that ethmoid bone is lined by mucous membranes that have canals or meduses that run through. We've got the nostril or the nares, right, the opening that gets air through this passageway. All of this connects back. Here's the mouth, the tongue, the base of the tongue muscle, the hard palate, the soft palate, the uvula, and then you've got some palatine tonsils that are back behind the tongue, back behind the side, the uvula on both sides, and then pharyngeal tonsils that are way back up in the back of the nasal cavity. You actually have 3 sets of tonsils. A lot of people have these removed, right? So we have this palatine tonsil that's back next to the uvula as that little, right? If you open your mouth and you go, ah, you see that little uvula that's hanging down? Tonsils are on either side of that. Often they're prone to, they have immune function, so they have white blood cells, and they're supposed to be able to get bacteria and fight different things. A lot of times they get prone to streptococcal infections, though. You get strep throat and they just get invaded and swollen and sore, and you get it too many times, you have to have those resected out. I had mine taken out when I was 10, because I had it just like 6 or 8 times in 1 year. So this is all the back of the nasal cavity. We call all of this the nasopharynx. All this is the pharynx. Everything connects together. We've got the nasopharynx, which is all of this. We've got the oropharynx, which is the back of the mouth and the throat, and the laryngopharynx, which is behind the larynx and the cartilage that makes up the voice box, and the entryway to the trachea. Okay, so esophagus, trachea. Okay, there's little vocal folds. That's what allows you to make sound and words and speech. We have this sort of little structure where we have an epiglottis, okay, and then the opening or the glottis. This is a trap door made of a certain type of cartilage. Remember in the beginning? Yes, that's right. Good. Elastic cartilage in the epiglottis and the ears, right? So the epiglottis is made of the elastic cartilage, and it's connected sort of here to the hyoid bone, which is that free-floating bone, right, where the tongue is anchored. Tongue is anchored to that specific bone. This trap door will actually, when you're swallowing and you eat food, this trap door closes. So it goes, and it shuts this opening. The glottis gets closed by the epiglottis. So if I'm drinking or eating, getting food down here, where do I want that food or fluid to go? Down the esophagus, which is right here. Not into the trachea. Notice this is air, this is in the front, and you can feel this, right? You can feel the windpipe or the trachea with the rings of hyaline cartilage, the C-shaped rings that go all the way down. You can actually palpate those and you can feel those. So air goes down the trachea, which is in front. Behind the trachea, there's the esophagus. So in this motion, when you swallow, this causes this epiglottis to tit down, allow food and drink to go down that way. Have any of you guys ever tried to like talk or laugh while you're eating or drinking? What happens when you like blow out pressure and you laugh really hard, or while you're drinking or eating? Yes. A lot of times it causes sort of an instant coughing reflex, because what happened is this didn't close in time and food or fluid went down the trachea, causes an instant constriction and coughing. And a lot of times this will come straight up and it'll go out your nose and out your mouth. Have you done that? Right? You're laughing or talking and joking, and then milk like comes straight out your nose. This is why, because you do not want fluid. You don't want fluid and food material to go down your trachea. The trachea is supposed to be an air-only passageway, right? That's what actually gets down into your lungs. So, the overall structures, I'm going to sort of leave this open for you guys to label and put that in, but we're going to add to these and go over these structures as we go through. Yes. Okay, I'll leave that so you can fill that in. And then we'll go through, as we go through, we'll start to name the structures. So the trachea is the windpipe, right? It goes down from sort of just underneath the mandible, right, all the way down. It splits into 2, the left main primary bronchus and the right main primary bronchus. So those are shown here, okay? It has a carina. It looks like chonies or underwear to me. I know that's weird, but it's a little segment where it allows the base of the trachea to split into 2. We call that the carina. Carina, it's like a segment or a section that splits off. And then we've got the lobes of the lung. Notice that the left lung has two major lobes. Superior lobe of the left lung is all here. Inferior lobe of the left lung is all here. Right lung, we've got three. Superior lobe, middle lobe, and inferior lobe of the right lung. So we also have this carved out sort of area right here where the left lung actually has that sort of notch or that groove. What is that for? Heart. That's for the heart, and we call that the cardiac notch because it is a notch. Okay, so we have trachea, carina, left and right primary bronchus, and then all of these sort of branch down. This branches again, and that's a secondary bronchi, and then this branches again, and that's a tertiary bronchi, and then as these get out distally here, these are bronchioles further out, right? So it goes primary, branches again, secondary, branches again, tertiary, and then becomes the small bronchioles that lead out to the alveoli or the air sacs. That would be all throughout the lungs, okay? So in general, the right lung is bigger than the left lung. It has 3 lobes instead of 2, and it lacks the cardiac notch. It also has a wider and thicker primary bronchus. The right primary bronchus is wider and thicker, a little bit shorter, but it's wider. So if I were to draw it, it's a little bit thicker than the left side. Okay. Oh, and I will say, this is what we call the conducting zone. Everything from the nares or the nostrils in the mouth to the pharynx to the trachea to the bronchi, going down to the bronchioles, that's all the conducting zone. Why? Because you're conducting air down to where gas exchange is going to need to happen. Okay? So this is sort of the lower end of the conducting zone that we're looking at here. We just looked at the upper respiratory section on the previous slide. So if we go down further, we look at the respiratory zone. So we've got the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. Now notice here we've added on in this diagram, they added at the ends of the bronchioles are these whole little sets of alveolar sacs. So it's like each one of these alveolar sacs is like a cluster of grapes. It's like when you pull out a cluster of grapes, it's got all these little branches and at least this whole little cluster. That's what we would call, and I think it's on here, alveolar sac. And then there are ducts that lead into these individual alveolar sacs. One of these individual guys is an alveolus or alveoli for plural. So alveolus. That's the singular term. One of those air sacs. And you looked at those under the microscope, and it really just looks like a bunch of circular spaces, right? Lined by really, really thin tissue or simple squamous epithelium. So you have the primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, and then you have terminal bronchioles. So the bronchioles go out to these alveolar sacs. Then the terminal bronchioles lead to the respiratory bronchioles. And those lead right into the alveolar ducts and the alveolar sacs, okay? So I want you to know the branching, the segmental branching that happens from trachea to primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, that means there's gas exchange that can happen in here, and the ducts that lead to the alveolar sacs. Because this is where the respiratory zone is, and if there's problems here or damage or fluid buildup or constriction of these muscles that line those bronchioles, you're going to have problems with gas exchange and breathing. And actually asthma is something that we'll look at that specifically is affected by those tissues or caused by aberrant responses in those tissues. So the alveoli and the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane is specifically this section of tissues right here. This is where respiration or gas exchange is happening. You've got the terminal bronchiole, the respiratory bronchiole that leads into the alveolar sacs. Notice that we have a set of blue sort of venules and capillaries coming down, and then the red capillaries and arterioles, or I'm saying this wrong already. I just switched it. So what is this? What would this side be? Arterial side, right? And arterial capillaries, and then the venule side that goes out to the veins that return to the heart. So remember, that oxygenated situation is reversed when we're talking about the lungs, because the lungs are the ones that provide the oxygen, right? So these capillaries are all over surrounding all of these alveoli. And if we can treat them in a certain way where basically the squamous tissue, the tissue is eaten away and it only leaves the capillaries. And in a scanning electron micrograph where you can go really high magnification and you can see beautiful surface detail, it's showing those pulmonary capillary casts, how an alveoli would be in each of these hollows. So they completely surround the alveoli. So that gas exchange can readily happen by these millions of capillaries that are all surrounding the alveoli. Okay. So looking closer at this respiratory membrane, so this is a cartoon rendition blown up so we can actually see in greater detail the anatomy of the respiratory membrane. You have an alveolus here. Okay, so this is one sac by itself. Notice it's surrounded by lots of capillaries. Okay, the capillaries are embedding and surrounding all of those alveoli. You have two different types of cells that make up the alveoli. You have a type 1 cell that basically is a simple squamous cell, and they line the spheres of these sacs. Okay, so that's single cell thick, super thin. And then you have a different type of cell, a type 2 cell. Shown here, they're green. They're not really green, but they do have a ruffled sort of border. They're brushier, bushier sort of, and they're here, 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 here. Okay, so they're interspersed. There's not as many of the type 2 cells. And then you have lots of capillaries surrounding. So what this allows for is if we look at this and we enlarge one of these capillary walls with one of the edge of the wall, the alveolus, and we blow it up, that's what the textbook did right here. I got this right from the textbook. You can see that the red blood cells traveling through the capillary, right? They're coming from the heart. They go through the pulmonary circuit. They're right up against the alveoli. And you can see that O2 can go into and diffuse across one cell layer thick, right, of the alveoli, and then one cell layer thick of the capillary wall. So here, I'll just outline. Here's one cell, here's another cell, that's lining the capillary wall. And here's one cell that's lining the alveolus. That's 2 cell layers thick with some little bit of fluid or space in between. So this readily allows gas exchange, oxygen to go in, get grabbed by the red blood cells, and it binds to a particular globular protein. What protein does oxygen bind onto? Hemoglobin, right? It's packed inside of these red blood cells, gets bound. Hemoglobin releases the CO2. It goes from high to low concentration, releases it into the alveolar sacs. CO2 is now accumulating here. Oxygen is accumulating in the blood. This is how you can take in oxygen and release CO2 and exhale it, okay? And these are basically fused basement membranes of the alveolar epithelium and the capillary epithelium. So there's protein, little lamina, basal lamina protein, a basement membrane that helps to cement sort of the wall of the capillary with the wall of the alveolus. So they're right next to each other. That's it. That's going to allow gas exchange to happen very efficiently. Type 2 cells, we'll come back to these later. The main ones that make up the alveoli are type 1, but type 2 are really critical because they make a detergent, if you will, called surfactant. Surfactant is really, really important in keeping these open and allowing gas exchange to continue, and we'll come back to that. Okay, there is a little video, I don't have it linked though, so I don't know if it's gonna work the right way. But I will go over the mechanics of sort of breathing, and I'll describe that process, and we'll go over the different parts that are involved in actual respiration. Basic functions of the respiratory system, of course, though, you all know this, and you knew this right away, right? Supply the body with oxygen and dispose of CO2. Get rid of the CO2. We actually have chemosensors or chemosensory detectors that are all throughout the body, in the brainstem and right above the heart. The carotid bodies and the aortic bodies that are right at the carotid arteries and right at the base of the aorta. And they detect levels of CO2. So when CO2 starts building up in your circulation, it stimulates your brain to pick up respiration rate and to breathe faster, right? To expel or get rid of that CO2. So your body is poised to detect these gas levels. How much CO2 and how much O2 do you have? And respiration rate is gonna be modulated to accommodate the needs of gases in the body. There's 4 processes that are involved in respiration. Okay, so we went over sort of the overall upper respiratory tract, and then the lower or conducting conducting portion of the respiratory tract, as well as the respiratory zone where the actual gas exchange happens. So conducting pathways and then the respiratory zone. The 4 processes that are involved in the overall process of respiration are pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, transport of respiratory gases, and internal respiration. And we'll go over these, but basically pulmonary ventilation, this is ventilation or movement of the lungs, right? Expanding and recoiling. Diaphragm moving down, lungs moving out, and then recoiling in expiration. So that overall process of ventilating the lungs with gas. External respiration is all the inspiration, all the air coming in, going down, the air going out and leaving the body. Transport of respiratory gases, that's gas exchange, carrying by the hemoglobin in the red blood cells gases throughout the entire body and transporting it where they need to go throughout the tissues of the body. Internal respiration, do you guys know what internal respiration is? Take a guess what internal respiration is. So this is kind of everything mechanically and gas exchange that we're going to talk about with the respiratory system. Internal. This is the metabolic respiratory aerobic respiration pathways that occur inside of cells, right? So you get the O2 there. Okay, so what? You get oxygen to the cells, all the cells throughout the body. They have to take that oxygen into themselves, use that oxygen in metabolic pathways involving the, what organelle? What organelle needs oxygen to make energy? Mitochondria. That's how you do aerobic respiration. Uses oxygen, uses the breakdown products of glucose, it's like a mass production of ATP using oxygen inside of the cells. So aerobic respiration, metabolic pathways in your cells. Once they receive the oxygen, it diffuses through their plasma membrane, and they need them, right? They need them to do aerobic respiration. That's what allows you to stay alive. We can't survive on glycolysis. That's just quick and dirty production of ATP out in the cytosol of the cells where they can break down glucose, generate lactic acid, and make like 2 ATP. Doesn't make enough energy. You need mitochondria and you need aerobic respiration. That's why we require oxygen from the atmosphere to sustain the cells of our body and make enough energy to stay alive. That's how we have evolved. Okay. So, functional anatomy of the respiratory organs. We've got the respiratory organs, the nose, the nasal cavity, the paranasal sinuses. Okay, and the paranasal sinuses are those sinuses in the bones that we looked at when we went through the skeletal system in lab. We've got the pharynx, the larynx, like the voice box, all of that is in here. The trachea, the windpipe, often people call it. The bronchi and the smaller branches of the bronchi, which terminate down into the bronchioles. Okay. The lungs themselves, so the tissue, the connective tissue and fibrous tissue and material of the lungs, along with the air sacs or the alveoli. Sorry, that was kind of quick. All of those, and remember these branch from primary bronchi to secondary bronchi to tertiary bronchi to terminal bronchioles. I always run out of space on here. And then into respiratory bronchioles, right? So it goes from here to here, from here to here, from there to there, and that's how it continues out. And then you get to the very smallest, the alveoli, right, that are surrounded by pulmonary capillaries that allow gas exchange, or that in that respiratory zone of the respiratory system. Okay. Organs of the respiratory system are divided into, as I mentioned, the conducting zone, the respiratory zone, okay? The bronchi in the conducting zone are really important because this is aiding getting that air, ambient air that you breathe in from the outside environment, down inside to the deep bronchioles and to the alveolar sacs. So they're extensively branched passageways, and it really is, it's a nature that humans were really excited to learn about and mystified by these, because the bronchi and the bronchioles that make up the lungs have a beautiful fractal branching pattern. Almost like a tree, right, that goes from really big to branching smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and you can go even really, really small, with every branch sort of going into 2 dichotomous sort of branches, all over in different 3-dimensional sort of pathways. So the nature of the branching of the lungs is described as fractal. It means you can look at the big level, it branches, and you can go smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, it continues branching. So it makes a beautiful tree, a bronchial tree. The primary bronchi or the main bronchi, you can use either terms. I specifically like to use primary, secondary, tertiary because it describes the level of branching in that fractal bronchial tree. But many people will call this the main bronchi. The primary bronchi is the largest. The right main primary bronchi is wider and shorter than the left primary bronchi. And remember, I showed you that. The right one over here is shorter, it's fatter. The lung tissue itself is more massive on the right side than on the left side, okay? So right lung is a little bigger than left lung. Okay, so if we look at it, again, we've got those structures. Left primary bronchus, right primary bronchus, and then they branch down to secondary or lobar and tertiary or segmental, all the way down to the bronchioles that are distally way out in the tissues, of the lungs. Okay, bronchi, the secondary bronchi, there's 3 on the right, there's 2 on the left. Again, looking at the right, there's 3 instead of 2. Now often these are called lobar bronchi because they serve the various lobes, right? They go out to the various lobes of the lungs. How many lobes does the left lung have? 2. How many lobes does the right lung have? 3. That makes perfect sense, right? So just envision when you're thinking about this in your mind, bless you, heart is tilted a little bit to the left side, has to have a little cardiac notch in the left lung, makes it a little smaller, okay? Left lung has superior and inferior lobes, right one has 3. So right away, 3 on the right, 2 on the left. Tertiary bronchi, those branch into each lung segment. The lobes of the lung are then further divided into little segments all throughout the lungs. You don't have to know all the different names, just know they branch into segments and they're served by the tertiary bronchi. And I like to just put numbers and kind of remember the level of branching at each. The bronchioles, they're little bronchi, and these are less than about 1 millimeter in diameter, so they're very small, teeny tiny. Terminal bronchioles, these are less than 0.5 millimeter in diameter, even tinier. So we're going from bigger to very, very small to microscopic, okay? So those are the structure of the bronchi. The bronchi in the conducting zone, this is looking at a micrograph image of a bronchus, a cross-section or transverse section right through it. You can see you've got pseudostratified epithelium lining the inside, so the inner layer, the lumen, this is where air, right? This is where air would be taken down and then taken back out. And then you've got some cartilage surrounding it, you've got smooth muscle surrounding this whole area. This is just a depiction of one of these bronchi, okay? Mucosa is the inner lining, and then it's surrounded by some cartilage and smooth muscle. Okay, so changes along those conducting pathways of the respiratory system. We've got supportive connective tissues changed. C-shaped rings are replaced by cartilage plates. So you have C-shaped rings of the trachea and the primary bronchi, and those become cartilaginous plates, so little plates of cartilage that are helping to keep them open. You've also got epithelial changes that line the mucosa. Mucosa is the inner lining of these internal structures. First, you have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Do you guys remember this one? Do you remember looking at that one in the trachea? We actually looked at this in lab under the microscopes, right, for histology. Then it changes to simple columnar, and then it goes to simple cuboidal. You don't have to know all these little jumps, but remember it starts here in the trachea and the bronchi. It starts with pseudostratified ciliated, and then it transitions into simpler type of epithelium. And then smooth muscle becomes really important. As you go down further in the bronchi and the bronchioles, they are wrapped with smooth muscle bands. So there's bands of smooth muscle fibers that wrap around especially the terminal and respiratory bronchioles. Bronchiole means like little bronchi. The bronchioles are out at the terminal ends of all the lobes of the lungs, right, or the segments of the lungs. The airways widen with sympathetic stimulation. The airways or bronchioles constrict with parasympathetic innervation. And you have nerves coming from the spinal cord, right, that activate either sympathetic or parasympathetic pathways. Why would the sympathetic nervous system, through nerves, why would the sympathetic nervous system widen the bronchioles?
More air.
More air, more air. You need more air, you need more oxygen to be able to do what you need to do in an emergency or a fight or flight situation, right? And how it does this is it causes smooth muscle relaxation. Those little bands are circumferential structures of smooth muscle around the bronchioles, if they relax, that allows the bronchioles to dilate or open up. And we call this your book goes over this, bronchodilation. You're opening up the bronchioles. Opposite in parasympathetic. Constricts or causes contraction of smooth muscle. And if smooth muscle lining the bronchioles constricts or contracts, what happens to the bronchioles? They get small. They clamp down. They get smaller. So if you contract smooth muscle, which is going around in a circle, all those fibers shorten and they close the size of the airway. And that is called, take a guess, what do you think constriction of the airways is called? Bronchoconstriction. Okay? Bronchodilation, bronchoconstriction. And that's with parasympathetic. You don't need a ton of air when you're just doing baseline, rest and digest, and just relaxing. Okay, so that's how the respiration and getting more air, more oxygen can be modulated. I'll stop right there. We'll finish, we'll talk about the nose and some of these other structures after our exam. So all of this stuff is not on the exam, right? I don't like to do it right before the exam, the preceding lecture. Respiratory system is final exam. But all the way through the last set of slides, right? We talked about blood vessels and diseases and disorders of the blood vessels, the heart, and the blood. Okay? Let me know if you have any questions, and you guys can